Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is Nick Patoski. He's going to tell us a great story about Willie Nelson.
The first time I met Willie was late 1973, like a couple months after I moved to Austin. I weaseled an interview with Willie Nelson at Coke FM, and I did it for Zoo World magazine, which was a third-tier music magazine. Rolling Stone, Cream, Crawdaddy, Phonograph Record Magazine, Zoo World. But I remember going up to the Coke FM offices, which was on the second floor of this funky little office building on North Lamar, and watching. I mean, I was kind of out in the hallway, but there was a room with a glass window, and I could see Willie being interviewed by Chet Flippo. And I knew who Chet Flippo was. That was kind of he was my guiding star. Here was a guy that was in Austin and writing about Austin, and I'm reading about it up in Minneapolis. And that's a motivator to want to come home. And there's Chet Flippo himself, and he's interviewing Willie. So I'm kind of watching, and Willie's in his it's kind of his jogging phase, I guess. He's got a t-shirt on, cut off shorts. He's got a headband. His hair is beginning to get long, and he's got a little diamond stud in his earlobe. So this was kind of like this melding, this person I'm looking at, kind of hippie, but kind of, country Nashville kind of guy. And I'm sure I asked some really stupid questions then. I didn't know much better. I knew who Willie was growing up in Fort Worth, that every Saturday night, the independent TV station, Channel 11 KTVT, would show all these country music shows and then top it off late in the evening with wrestling from the Northside Coliseum and then roller derby. And I was a big viewer, but early on, this cavalcade of country music shows started with the Cowtown Jamboree, which was basically a little live music show hyping whatever the show was that night at Panther Hall in Fort Worth, which was a great country music venue. And Willie Nelson was always on there, hyping this Cowtown Jamboree. And it's like, you kind of recognize the face and all that. But that was the extent of my knowledge of Willie Nelson until I'm in Minneapolis at the Electric Fetus, and I'm turned on to Yesterday's Wine. And man, I started playing the shit out of that, and that was it was a deep album. I mean, forget this Texas connection, but it was also one of these motivators to want to go home. Here was a deep thinking, this guy's straight up country, but he's talking about mortality and what are you doing here on earth? I mean, it's deep shit. And I kind of, tapped into the fact that this is where Rolling Stone was acknowledging, Chet Flippo was writing about Willie. So, this was legitimizing this country music guy in a way that when I sat down with him, he was a big deal in Austin. He was becoming a big deal. But you got to understand, 1973, Austin, I mean, there was a scene bubbling up, but it was pretty much Jerry Jeff Walker, Michael Murphy, Willis Allen Ramsey. These were old folkies that started wearing cowboy hats. But in this mix, B.W. Stevenson, he had the hit records at the time. He was actually having hit records. But into this mix were these two outliers, Doug Somm, who'd moved to Austin after getting beat up in San Antonio after he'd come back from California. He saw Austin as a free space where he wouldn't get beat up anywhere. He could be a long-haired cowboy. And Willie Nelson had wound up in Austin. Willie's house burned down in Nashville right before Christmas. And he's kind of like without a place to stay. And his booking agent in Texas said, I know this dude ranch in Bandera. It's, bankrupt right now. It's empty. You guys, you can go stay there. And, at the time, Willie was living in Ridgetop outside of Nashville. And it was Willie Nelson and many others. He had basically kind of a commune almost going. A lot of his band members lived out on this, rural piece of property. His mother and her husband lived on one side. His mother and father, they were divorced, but they both lived there with their spouses. So the mailbox said Willie Nelson and many others. So when the house burns down, what's going to happen with the many others? Well, a lot of them, his band basically came with him to Bandera, which is the cowboy capital of Texas. It's full of dude ranches. And they all hung out, spent the winter at this defunct dude ranch playing golf, which was an activity Willie had taken, but also B. Spears, the bass player who had joined Willie's band, was coming up from San Antonio, where he'd grown up, and he was bringing LSD. So they were taking acid and doing things like playing golf backwards, starting at the hole and going to the tee, and supporting themselves by playing every Saturday night at Flores General Store in Helotes outside of San Antonio. They had a Winnebago. That's how they got around, a big old Winnebago. They led up to Winnebago one day to come visit Bobby, Willie's sister, who lived in Austin. She had followed Willie to Fort Worth when they were young people in the 50s. And she had briefly lived in Nashville amongst the many others. But she had moved to Austin, and she was working the piano bar circuit. Very popular. Coach Darrell Royal of the UT Longhorns was a fan of Bobby's and would go to the Mike and Charlie's piano bar and sit there and listen to her, befriended her. And Willie knew Austin because in the 60s, when he was a country music Nashville recording artist, writing songs was not enough. He wanted to be that performer. Baron Young, Ray Price offered him a lot of money. Just stay at home and write songs for him. No, I want to be you. That was basically Willie. So his period in Nashville from 1960 through 1972 or so was all about, he's writing songs and being successful, but it was about trying to bust through as a performer. To augment that, he played live. And the one place that he could play live consistently throughout the 1960s was Texas. So they would make that killer drive from Nashville, play Fort Worth almost every weekend, it seemed like, at Panther Hall. But he'd come down to Austin, and Coach Royal had met him when he played package shows. He toured with people like Charlie Pride and, a country music guy. But when he came back to Austin to basically after his house burned down, he came back to visit Bobby. And they were going to pay her a visit this one trip, but they picked up a hippie chick in their RV, in their Winnebago. And she was, "Where are you going?" "Well, I'm going to Austin." And she asked to be let out at this place, the Armadillo World Headquarters. And they did. They dropped her off. And Willie he had his eyes open. And it wasn't long afterwards that he and Paul English approached the Armadillo. "I want to play here." At the time, Willie was going to live in a condo in Houston with his wife Connie. Connie told me that it was one of these. Willie came down here and playing the Armadillo in 1972 was kind of this breakthrough. The hippies and the rednecks lied down together and found a common bond in beer, weed, and Willie. Everybody loved country music, and that became kind of a new thing with hippies. It's like embrace country music. And especially Willie was kind of this old guy. He's 40 years old. In country music years, you're supposed to be selling insurance or just retiring to the country club by then. Instead, he reinvented his whole career. And among the hipsters and the hippies, you had these folkies doing country. That's okay. But, if you really want to kind of get deep in the weeds, go with this old, neoclassical country, this guy with Nelson was a guy to follow. This is concurrent with Jerry Wexler first went to San Antonio looking for Doug Somm. Jerry Wexler was given a label, the Ertegun brothers gave him a custom label, Atlantic Nashville. Why don't you do that? And Jerry had done all this rhythm and blues stuff for Atlantic. He wanted to get off on a different trip, so Atlantic Nashville. Jerry Wexler is going to sign acts. And the first two acts he signs are Doug Somm and Willie Nelson. And people in Nashville are going, what the fuck? Who is this Doug Sham? And Willie Nelson, didn't he just cycle out from Chet Atkins? After how many years? This is a new act. So Wexler is going way off the farm to chase what he believes in. And he believes in Doug Sahm because here's the guy that can play all kinds of music authentically. And he loves that. And okay, I'm going to make you a star, and does a kind of a super session with Bob Dylan and Dr. John and Fathead Newman up at the Atlantic Studios in New York, which turns out to be a flop. It doesn't really sell much. At the same time, Willie goes to New York, and in the course of I think it's 5 days, recorded 2 albums, a record at Atlantic Studios. No one's done that. And he's been such an animal, a product of the Nashville assembly line recording system. He knows how to cut quick and efficiently. And, in Atlantic Studios in New York, where everybody's indulging one another, this is kind of a new thing. But he records Shotgun Willie, his debut album on Atlantic Records for Atlantic Nashville. And he records a gospel album, The Troublemaker, which comes out later. Well, Shotgun Willie, similarly, is not a big hit anywhere, but it is kind of outside the box. It shows Willie is given the keys to the car, and here are the possibilities. So, with Wexler's help, you hear horns. There's horns on the record. There's no horns coming out of Nashville, except maybe Marty Robbins horns. But no one's doing horns like that. And it's funky, and the title cut. Shotgun Willie sits around in his underwear, biting on a bullet and pulling out all his hair, trying to write a song. He's writing a song about, and it's written on a Tampax wrapper and hit the Holiday Inn in New York, where he's trying to write a song for his album. And it's kind of, totally self-referential. And it's a pretty great record. And he does, that's where he does a new version of Me and Paul. It's just, it's all over the place. But that too is not a hit, except in Austin and kind of throughout in the satellite cities of Texas, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. It becomes a thing. And part of it is Coke FM is this radio station that plays progressive country music, whatever that is. So you can hear the Rolling Stones, Ernest Tubb, right next to each other, and all these local acts that are beginning to boom up. You can hear B.W. Stevenson, Willis Allen, wall to wall around the clock. And then here comes Shotgun Willie. So it gets played a lot. And, in Austin, all of a sudden, by the second album that he does for Atlantic Nashville, Phases and Stages, Willie's kind of like he's on a level with all these guys. And really by then in 74, because he's had Phases and Stages, and by the second Willie Nelson picnic, the first picnic's in 73, and that gets a lot of attention. Waylon and Willie and Billy Joe Shaver and Doug Sahm and some of these rock and roll acts and Leon Russell. This is kind of this blending that's coming together. So by the second picnic, Willie is bigger than all these people. By 1974, Willie has eclipsed everyone. And oddly enough, back in Nashville, they still don't know what's going on in Austin. And certainly the Erdogan brothers don't. So it's like, they put they cut the cord. Atlantic Nashville is folded, just as Willie's got his duet with Tracy Nelson, After the Fire Is Gone, is starting to chart. And Phases and Stages is getting some attention, but the plug's pulled. So no one knows about that album. Is kind of forgotten. And to me, that is the best Willie Nelson album out there. That is his first great concept record. Yesterday's Wine kind of articulated that in a country aspect. But he goes full bore in Phases and Stages, and it sets the stage for Red-Headed Stranger, which definitely announces to the rest of the world outside of Texas who this guy is and who he becomes. So getting to interview him that first time, he was very tolerant, and I'm just sure he liked the attention, that, and especially these hippie kids coming around asking questions. It was a whole new deal for him. So he was very open and kind. And, it started a relationship where I could go to the well, I could get interviews with Willie and I started hanging out and, being part of what this phenomenon was really up until, with Red-Headed Stranger and the way he blew up. I kind of, at that point, I wasn't doing the hang as much as I had been because it got too big. I mean, 200 people backstage. And the interesting thing is backstage was, you'd see these Texas politicians, you'd see celebrities, you'd see a lot of dope dealers. You would see all walks of life and they all wanted to be around Willie. And it was just an incredible phenomenon to watch blow up. And I've been lucky enough to kind of like go back to the well every year or two ever since. I mean, I had a history. So in 2006, when I got it in my mind to do a book, because Willie's going to be 75 in 2008, and that's a great way to honor him, I just took it upon myself to write a book. And I didn't ask permission at first. I just started working on it. I got a contract with Little Brown. And I was like, I was a year into research when I finally sat down with him. And it was at the Saxon Pub. His daughter Paula was going to do an afternoon concert on a Sunday afternoon, somewhere around the Christmas holidays. And I go into the club and it's empty, but he's in the back corner booth. Of course, corner booth with looking out, so he sees everyone coming in. There he is. So I sit down and I say, "Hey, Willie, I've been doing a lot of obsessing about you." And he kind of gives me a smile. I said, "I know. People call me, have been asking, about talking to you." And, then it's kind of like a little pause and the heart starts very well. And he said, "I'm sure glad you're doing this." And so that was it. And it wasn't like, I'm not going to him for fact checking or anything like that. I said, "So you're going to talk to me?" He said, "Sure." Which in Willie speak is like, yeah. Come see me. Come to the bus and tell him I said to come. Good luck. And so I was still working another year almost on this. And it was, and just doing my business. I didn't know when I was going to talk to him or what was going to happen. And I had to also think, I might not sit down with him. This may not happen. Willie's big. He's hard to get a hold of. In 2007 in May, I think it was, or April, so maybe it was February, somewhere in the spring of 2007, the band spent a week playing the Fillmore, and they'd been doing this for a couple or 3 years, the Fillmore in San Francisco, and doing a residency and packing it out. And that was a perfect time. I contacted my friend Sylvie Simmons. "Sylvie, can I stay at your place?" A fellow music critic, and she let me stay in her place in Lower Haight. I was staying there, and I would go every day to the show. I mean, every night to the show, but also every day I would go out to. I think they were out somewhere near Tiburon the band was staying at a hotel, and I would go talk to everyone that I hadn't talked to, like hadn't talked to Jody Payne. At that time, Jody Payne was spending most of his time at the bar, so I spent time at the bar in an early afternoon to get what I needed. Tunin' Tom, the keeper of Trigger, I hadn't talked to, and he was elusive. He was like one of these guys. He didn't like talking to people, but the rest of the crew was like, "Come on, Tom." So I got with him, and I'd hang out. I'd hang out with Mickey Raphael, who is Pootie Locke, later explained, Pootie being Willie's road manager. Mickey's the reader in the band. So that's how I knew that when I wrote this book and put it out, Mickey gave it the okay, so everybody was okay. So all this is happening all during the week. And on the last night, it's raining. And I contacted David Anderson. "Can I come on the bus, just thank Willie?" "Yeah." But I'm sitting out in the rain. It's before the show. And Gates Moore sees me, one of the bus drivers. He said, "Come on in. Just come on." And Willie was talking with the daughter of Mark Rothbaum at his table, and I waited no, it's Mark Rothbaum's sister. When the sister leaves, Willie, "Hey, come on up." And first thing he says is, "Well, when are we going to talk?" I said, "Whenever you want." He said, "How about after the show tonight?" And I said, "Okay." So what that meant is once he said that, and that was great, I got the permission. Show hadn't started. I had to run back, running like a mile and a half back to Sylvie's apartment, grab all my shit, and take my rent car, which was parked at Sylvie's, back to the San Francisco airport, drop it off, get a cab, go back to the Fillmore. And I'm out of breath when I get there, and the show is just ending. And I'm like, so I've got my stuff with me. And I'm going to go. Usually I'm hanging with Mickey at the end of the show. He was fun to hang with and we were buddies. I thought, no, I better go on the bus first. And the show had not quite ended. So I got my stuff and got on the bus. And then all of a sudden, here comes Bobby onto the bus and she tosses a spray of red roses that someone's given her to me. And Willie comes on and all of a sudden he's signing 2 or 3 posters for the Fillmore. And I swear to God, within 5 minutes, the bus is rolling. Now, back in the old days, before Willie had carpal tunnel and he was younger, he would stay at a gig till every last fan got what they wanted, whether it was a picture or an autograph. That's Willie, and that's one reason he's Willie, and he is the person who we know he is. He would always do that, but with carpal tunnel, and he was hitting, he's 73 at this time, he was getting limited of what he could do and what he couldn't do. So that was the new thing, is I just sign a few posters and get out of there. And like when I was interviewing the band, Willie never showed up. The bus was parked somewhere where no one knew it was. So bus is rolling, and I'm watching, and Lana, his daughter, his eldest daughter, she cooks Bobby and Willie breakfast as the bus is rolling. And it's organic eggs with grapeseed, hash browns. I'm trying to remember what else they had. It was a really good breakfast. And they have breakfast as the bus is rolling. And after breakfast is done, Bobby retreats, goes back to her bunk, and Willie and I start to talk. And I've got my recorder. And, I'm trying to remember all the stuff that I wanted to ask him and all that. I didn't know this was going to be the time. We started a little after, probably about 11 o'clock, because they had to eat first. And the bus was rolling by 10, it seemed like. But we went till about 3 a.m. And at that point, he'd smoked me under the table. I'm a smoker. And, again, if you're, I'm a smoker of cannabis. And if you're going to smoke, or if you're going to do anything with cannabis, that's the mountaintop. Willie is the gold standard. And so I'm keeping up with him all right. And we're going, but at 3 a.m, it's like, I forgot what I just asked him. I forgot what we were talking about. And usually I had a question lined up in the back, and I didn't. And I got to go to bed. I can't go anymore. And David Anderson said, well, we're in Santa Rosa, California. Here's your hotel key. Willie's got the day off tomorrow. So, you can go for round number 2. And Gates came and fetched me about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And Willie and I went for about 3 more hours. And I'd had the advantage of going over my computer with my manuscript and basically figuring out what I hadn't asked him and what I needed to ask him. And it was funny because, during this time, we're sitting on the bus and it's a day off. So, Willie gets calls. He gets calls from his wife, Annie. He gets calls from Ray Price. And he'll stop and take those. And he'd done his morning exercise. So he had a bicycle in the hatch on the bus. I said, so you rode the bike around? He said, yeah. I said, was it good? And he said, yeah. And I said, don't you ever get lost? And he laughed. And he said, all the time. And I said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, I just go knock on a door. And I say, I'm Willie Nelson. Can you tell me where I am? and he always finds his way back. But he gave me pretty much everything I asked for. There were a few questions that it's like, I didn't want the thing to end, and I didn't go there. And there were some sensitive subjects. His son, Billy, had kind of a tragic life and ended tragically at a reasonably young age. And whenever you talk to Willie about Billy, the eyes start tearing up immediately. And it's just like, how far are you going to go with this? And but it was great, and he rolled up one more reef. And again, I don't know that he smoked. I was hiring a Georgia Pine, but he gave me a couple reefers afterwards, and rolled me joints. He said, "Here, take these with you on the road." And I might have smoked one that night, but the next morning I had to drive to San Jose to the airport from Santa Rosa, where I'd never been before. Liked it so much I went back 6 months later. but I got my rent car, and damned if I'm going to, let this go. So I lit up in the car, and man, shortly afterwards, went over the Richmond East Bay Bridge around Richmond. And it was the weirdest experience because all of a sudden it just started, I get tunnel vision and I started sweating. And I've never had this on a bridge before, but it was like that. I had to kind of keep my eyes peeled to drive, and I thought I was freaking out. And I told Willie's ex-wife, Connie, about that after the fact. I said, yeah, I had kind of a meltdown on the bridge because for smoking that Willie weed. And she said, he would love to know that, you should tell him. Because he always had the best. And it was, you'd see that in San Francisco, there were dealers that would come on board, or people had been growers had been saving stuff for Willie. And at that time, California had some medical marijuana clinics, but that was it. Pootie Locke basically was led on a tour of clinics. They let him in with an entourage because Pootie was Pootie and Willie is Willie. The interesting thing is, back in those Atlantic Nashville days, in Austin in the early 70s, Doug Somm was the educated cannabis consumer because he had been turned on by J.R. Chatwell from the Modern Mountaineers and the Tune Wranglers, who went in the 1930s. The Modern Mountaineers did a song called Mary Jane. I mean, these were hip cats from way back when. He wouldn't even have to drive down to Mexico, but you could drive to Mexico and just bring stuff back. No one knew. And JR kind of turned Doug onto weed. So when Doug winds up in San Francisco in the late 60s, he's already an old soul. He knows about varieties and varietals. And in this film that I did on Doug Somm, Jan Winter of Rolling Stone talks about that Doug knew. He was like, he had a very mature attitude. So Doug kind of, I think, opened the door to Willie. Willie, when he had been experimenting, he'd tripped and he'd gotten into weed in Nashville, but that was all under the table. You couldn't talk about that stuff. And in Austin, he began to embrace it. And his ex-wife, Connie, said, and Lana both said, Willie was a really shitty drunk. Paul English said the same. Willie get drunk, I'd have to take the keys from him. But marijuana tamped down the anger and just the bad habits that alcohol seemed to bring on. And so he turned into a kind of sometimes drinker, not much of a drinker at all. And he became a full-time pot smoker. And today, to me, he is that symbol. As when he parked his bus, this was about 5 years ago, he did a residency at the Radio City Music Hall in New York. The bus is parked outside. And every day it would be Snoop Dogg knocking on his door, not Willie knocking on Snoop Dogg's door. And that's basically, as far as the ranking goes, that's all you need to know.